Hello everyone, I'm Mr. Edison, and I'm here to guide you into a peaceful slumber. If you find this video helpful, please give it a thumbs up and subscribe to the channel. I'd love to know where you're from and what time it is as you unwind. So settle in, get cozy, and let the relaxation begin. I live in Guwahati, a bustling city in northeastern India, but every holiday season and occasionally during summer breaks, my parents and I make the journey to my grandmother's house in the countryside. The year was 2018 and I had just turned 18, finishing my first semester of university studies when the winter break arrived. Our family tradition of visiting grandmother remained unbroken despite my new academic responsibilities. The village of Raikon sits nestled between agricultural flatlands and dense forest areas in Assam, approximately 4 hours from the city by car. My grandmother's house, a sturdy two-story structure built by my grandfather in the 1970s, stands near the edge of the community, where civilization gradually surrenders to wilderness. The property includes several acres of farmland and backs up against a section of woods that locals tend to avoid after sunset. My grandmother, whom we affectionately call Ita, has lived alone since my grandfather passed 12 years ago. Despite numerous offers to relocate her to the city, she refuses to leave the home where she raised her children and tends the land that has been in our family for generations. Her independence is admirable, but the isolation of her property has always filled me with unease. The journey from Guwahati follows winding roads that narrow as they approach Raikon. Mobile phone reception becomes increasingly sporadic, and by the time we reach the village, connectivity is limited to a single spot near the post office. This digital isolation compounds the physical remoteness, creating a sense of being cut off from the modern world. Our car pulled into the gravel driveway of Aida's house on a December evening. The winter air carried the scent of wood smoke and ripening tea leaves from nearby plantations. My father honked twice, our traditional arrival signal, and before we could gather our luggage, Ada appeared on the veranda, her silhouette framed by the soft glow of oil lamps she insists on using despite having electricity. "Welcome." "Welcome," she called, her weathered hands extended in greeting. "The food is warm and waiting." The interior of Ada's house remains largely unchanged from my childhood memories. Hand-woven tapestries adorn walls of polished teak. Photographs in tarnished frames chronicle our family history. The dining room table, crafted from a single massive slab of native wood, dominates the central space. Around this table, generations of my family have shared meals, stories, and secrets. After dinner, as we settled into the familiar routine of unpacking and preparing for bed, my mother reminded me that we would be joined by several relatives in the coming days. Her brothers would arrive with their families for the seasonal gathering, and the quiet house would soon fill with conversation and laughter. What she didn't mention, what nobody explicitly mentioned, was that the gathering also served as a form of protection. In Raikon, people rarely stayed alone, especially during the winter months when darkness claimed more hours than light. There was safety in numbers, though from what precisely, no one could definitively say. My bedroom occupied the southeast corner of the upper floor, with windows overlooking both the main road and the extensive backyard that gradually merged with the woods. As I prepared for sleep that first night, I noticed my father checking the locks twice and securing the wooden shutters with particular attention to detail. When I questioned this precaution, he merely shrugged. "Old habits," he said. "Rest well. Tomorrow, we begin the preparations." I fell asleep to the sound of night birds calling from the woods and the distant murmur of my parents conversing in hushed tones downstairs. My dreams that night were fragmented, filled with shadowy figures moving between trees and the sensation of being watched through the darkness. I awoke several times, disoriented and sweating despite the winter chill, convinced I had heard something scraping against my window. Morning brought clarity and dismissed the nocturnal fears as mere products of an overactive imagination. Yet as I joined my family for breakfast, I couldn't shake the lingering unease that had accompanied me from sleep. Looking around the table at my parents and grandmother, I realized they all carried a similar tension in their shoulders, a vigilance in their eyes that seemed out of place in the daylight. "Is everything all right?" I asked, spreading homemade butter on warm roti. My father and mother exchanged glances before Aita spoke. Rikon has always been different from the city, she said carefully. There are things here that cannot be explained by your science books or university professors. Things that have been happening since before I was born. What kind of things? I pressed, though some part of me already knew the answer. Stories, my father interjected. Just old village stories to explain coincidences and natural phenomena. Ida's expression suggested disagreement, but she remained silent, focusing instead on her tea. The conversation shifted to preparations for the family gathering, but the seed of curiosity had been planted. I resolved to learn more about these stories that caused such evident concern among my otherwise rational family members. Little did I understand that by the end of our stay, I would contribute my own chapter to the dark anthology of Rikon's unexplained phenomena. The village of Rikon predates written records of the region. According to Ada, the settlement originated as a waypoint for traders traveling between the hills and the plains. Its location near a natural spring and fertile soil made it ideal for agriculture, while the surrounding forests provided wood, game, and medicinal plants. Over centuries, families established permanent residences, creating the community that exists today. The morning after our arrival, I accompanied Ada to the local market. The village center consisted of a single main road flanked by wooden structures housing various shops and businesses. Vendors displayed vegetables, spices, and handcrafted items on colorful tarps spread across the ground. The atmosphere was communal, with neighbors greeting each other and exchanging news while completing their purchases. As we moved through the market, I noticed how people regarded my grandmother with particular respect. They stepped aside to allow her passage, offered her the best of their produce, and frequently consulted her on matters that seemed to extend beyond simple commerce. When I questioned this obvious deference, Aita explained that her position as one of the oldest continuous residents granted her a certain status. People believe I remember things that others have forgotten, she said, selecting ginger roots from a weathered wooden basket. And perhaps they are right. What kinds of things? I asked, helping her place the purchases in her cloth bag. The history of Rikon is not written in books, she replied. It lives in stories passed from one generation to the next. Some of these stories explain why certain areas remain undeveloped, why particular traditions persist, and why caution governs our movements after dark. We paused at a tea stall operated by an elderly man whose deeply lined face suggested decades of exposure to the elements. He nodded to Ada and prepared our drinks without requiring an order. As we sat on a narrow wooden bench, sipping the strong, sweet liquid, Aita continued her explanation. Rikon has always attracted unusual occurrences, she said. Her voice lowered despite the bustling market around us. Some attribute this to the specific geography. The confluence of forest, farmland, and water creates what old practitioners call a thin boundary. Others believe that historical events have left impressions that continue to resonate through time. Historical events? I prompted. During the colonial period, this region witnessed considerable conflict, she explained. Not all of it documented by official records. Local resistance fighters used these forests as bases for operations against British forces. Reprisals were severe. Many disappeared without proper burial rites. A middle-aged woman approached our table, interrupting the conversation to greet Aita and inquire about my father. After she departed, Aita changed the subject, discussing instead the preparations for the upcoming family gathering. I sensed her reluctance to elaborate further in such a public setting and decided not to press the issue. Later that afternoon, while helping my father clean the small cabin behind the main house where the men traditionally gathered during family events, I broached the subject again. The cabin stood approximately 50 meters from the main structure, positioned near a stand of bamboo that marked the transition between cultivated land and wild forest. A narrow footpath connected it to the house, crossing a small seasonal stream that currently contained only a trickle of water. Dad, what exactly are these stories about Rikon that everyone seems to know but nobody wants to discuss? I asked, sweeping accumulated dust from the wooden floor. My father paused his work organizing chairs against the wall, considering his response. Unlike Ida, who embraced the mystical aspects of village life, my father had pursued education and embraced rationality. His position on unexplained phenomena typically involved logical explanations and scientific reasoning. Every small village has its legends, he began cautiously. Isolated communities develop collective narratives to explain unusual occurrences or reinforce social boundaries. Rikon is no different. But something happened to you here, didn't it? I pressed. Something you can't explain? He turned to face the window, looking out toward the line of bamboo swaying gently in the afternoon breeze. For a moment, his typically confident demeanor faltered, revealing uncertainty beneath. There are incidents I've witnessed that defy conventional explanation, he admitted. Experiences shared by others within the family and village. These accounts display remarkable consistency despite coming from observers of different backgrounds, education levels, and generational perspectives. Like what? I urged. The most notable occurred during my university break, approximately 25 years ago, he said, turning back to face me. I was with my cousin and two uncles in this very cabin. We were celebrating my acceptance to graduate studies, talking late into the night. He gestured toward the rear window that overlooked the bamboo grove. It was well past midnight when we saw it, a sphere of blue light moving horizontally through the bamboo. Not flickering like flame, but steady and controlled, approximately 1 meter above the ground. It traveled in a straight line, maintaining consistent speed and elevation despite the uneven terrain. Could it have been someone carrying a lantern? I suggested. That was our initial assumption, he nodded. We called out, thinking perhaps a villager had wandered onto the property. When no one responded, my uncle suggested it might be someone with ill intent, perhaps surveying the property for theft. We quickly extinguished our own lamp to avoid being visible targets and observed in silence. He moved to the window, pointing toward the thick stand of bamboo. The light passed behind this thick cluster, where it should have been momentarily obscured before reappearing on the other side. Instead, it simply vanished. We waited several minutes, but it never emerged. When we investigated the area the following morning, we found no footprints, no disturbed vegetation, no evidence of human passage. Maybe it was ball lightning or some natural phenomenon, I suggested. Perhaps, he conceded. Though the controlled movement pattern contradicts known behavior of electrical atmospheric phenomena, and it fails to explain similar sightings reported consistently over decades by different observers. Before I could respond, my mother called from the main house, requesting our help with moving furniture to accommodate the expected guests. The conversation ended there, but my father's uncharacteristic openness about the experience left a profound impression. If his rational mind could find no satisfactory explanation for what he witnessed, what other phenomena might defy conventional understanding in this seemingly ordinary village? Over dinner that evening, I observed my parents and grandmother with new awareness. Their cautionary behaviors, checking locks, avoiding certain areas after dark, maintaining traditional protective practices, suddenly appeared less as superstitious habits and more as reasonable precautions based on actual experiences. As darkness settled over Rikon that night, I found myself paying closer attention to sounds from the surrounding forest. The calls of night birds seemed to carry new significance. The rustling of leaves in the gentle breeze took on a more purposeful quality. And when a branch scratched against my window, I no longer dismissed it as random movement but wondered what might be attempting to gain entry. Sleep came reluctantly, and when it did, my dreams were filled with blue lights moving through endless corridors of bamboo, always just beyond my reach. The story of the blue light fascinated me. Over the next few days, as relatives began arriving for the gathering, I discreetly collected additional accounts of the phenomenon. My approach was methodical. I avoided leading questions and documented variations in descriptions to identify core consistencies across multiple witnesses. My uncle arrived with his wife and children on the third day of our stay. After the initial commotion of greetings and settling in, I found an opportunity to speak with him privately, while helping him unload supplies from his vehicle. He had been present during the blue light incident my father described. "Uncle, Dad mentioned something about a strange light you all saw years ago," I began casually. "I'm curious about your perspective on what happened." He paused, a bag of rice balanced against his hip, and surveyed the tree line beyond the property as if ensuring our privacy. "Your father told you about that, did he?" He seemed surprised. He usually avoids discussing such matters. He was surprisingly open about it, I confirmed, though he attempted to rationalize the experience. My uncle laughed softly. "Always the academic, your father. Some things resist scientific categorization, especially in Rikon. As we continued unloading the vehicle, he shared his recollection of that night 25 years ago. His account largely aligned with my father's description, a spherical blue light moving horizontally through the bamboo grove behind the cabin. However, he included details my father had omitted. The light appeared approximately 15 minutes after we had been discussing my grandfather's funeral, he explained. Your great-grandfather died in those woods while hunting. His body was found leaning against a particular bamboo cluster that no longer exists. The coincidental timing of our conversation and the light's appearance seemed significant. Do you believe it was his spirit? I asked, maintaining a neutral tone despite my skepticism. I make no definitive claims, he replied carefully. But consider this. The light moved with purpose, not random drift. It maintained exactly 1 meter elevation, the approximate height of a lantern carried by hand. And most notably, it emitted no sound, not the crackling of flame, not the rustle of vegetation being disturbed, not the footfalls that would accompany a human traveler. He described the light's color as unlike any natural blue, neither the cool blue of morning sky nor the electric blue of certain insects, but rather a deep penetrating azure that seemed to contain its own internal darkness. The description was peculiarly specific, suggesting a visual impact that had remained vivid despite the passage of decades. We investigated the next morning, he continued, confirming this detail from my father's account. The ground was soft from recent rain, yet showed no footprints or disturbance. The bamboo stalks are densely packed, making passage without contact impossible, yet nothing was broken or bent. Most compelling was his revelation that the phenomenon had recurred twice in subsequent years. Once 5 years later when he was staying at the property alone, and again during a family wedding 12 years ago when multiple guests reported seeing the light from different vantage points simultaneously. Has anyone attempted to approach it? I asked, to determine its nature more directly. His expression darkened. Your second cousin tried that during the wedding. He was 17, impulsive, full of city confidence. He pursued the light into the bamboo grove. What happened? He returned approximately 20 minutes later, disoriented and unable to account for his movements during that time. He recalled following the light for what felt like seconds before suddenly finding himself on the opposite side of the property with no memory of the intervening journey. He complained of intense headaches for 3 days afterward. By the time we finished unloading the vehicle, other relatives had arrived, curtailing our private conversation. However, over the next 2 days, I gathered corroborating accounts from 3 additional family members who claimed to have witnessed the phenomenon. The descriptions maintained remarkable consistency in terms of the light's appearance, movement patterns, and the unsettling absence of accompanying sound. On the 5th night of our stay, with the house now full of extended family members, several cousins suggested we gather in the cabin for games and conversation. My parents exchanged concerned glances but relented when my uncles volunteered to accompany us. 8 of us made our way down the narrow path as darkness settled, carrying lanterns and snacks for the evening. The cabin's interior felt different when occupied by multiple people. Less ominous, more intimate. We arranged chairs in a circle and began playing cards while sharing university experiences and future plans. The conversation flowed easily, punctuated by laughter and good-natured teasing. Around 11:30 p.m., the youngest uncle present suggested we extinguish the lamps and tell ghost stories, a tradition from our childhood gatherings. Despite my newfound interest in unexplained phenomena, I felt a flicker of childhood apprehension at the prospect of sitting in total darkness while conjuring frightening narratives. The lamps were turned down to a minimal glow, creating deep shadows in the corners of the cabin. My uncle began with a traditional regional tale involving a bride who died before her wedding and haunted the riverside where she had drowned. The familiar story carried new impact in the dimly lit cabin, with the sounds of night creatures providing an atmospheric backdrop. As the story concluded, something caught my attention through the rear window, a faint blue illumination moving slowly among the bamboo stalks. I froze, uncertain whether I was experiencing the phenomenon I had been investigating or merely imagining it based on the accounts I'd gathered. Look, I whispered, pointing toward the window. There's something out there. Conversation ceased immediately as everyone turned toward the indicated direction. The blue light was unmistakable now, a perfect sphere approximately 20 centimeters in diameter, moving horizontally through the bamboo at precisely the height my relatives had described. It emitted steady illumination without flickering, casting eerie blue reflections on the surrounding vegetation. "Nobody move," my eldest uncle instructed quietly. "Nobody speak." We watched in collective silence as the light progressed methodically through the grove. From our vantage point, we could track its movement for approximately 45 seconds before it passed behind a particularly dense cluster of bamboo. As in previous accounts, it never emerged from the other side. The silence persisted for several minutes afterward, broken finally by my cousin, who exhaled sharply. "That's exactly what I saw 12 years ago," he confirmed. "Exactly the same." My uncle rose and checked that the cabin door was securely latched before addressing us. "We should return to the main house now," he said, together maintaining close proximity. No one lags behind, no one runs ahead. The return journey proceeded in tense silence, our lanterns held high to illuminate the path clearly. Though the distance was short, those minutes of walking felt extraordinarily prolonged. I found myself repeatedly glancing toward the bamboo grove, half expecting to see the blue light pacing our progress. Back in the main house, the adults gathered in the kitchen while we younger members were instructed to prepare for sleep. Through the partially open door, I overheard fragments of concerned conversation. References to increasing frequency and unusual pattern deviation suggested the phenomenon we witnessed was somehow different from previous occurrences. Sleep eluded me for hours that night. When I finally drifted off near dawn, my dreams were filled with azure illumination that transformed from spherical shape to humanoid figure, and back again, always maintaining that peculiar silence while observing me from just beyond reach. The following morning, no one mentioned the incident at breakfast. The day proceeded with preparations for the main family celebration scheduled for that evening. Only when I found myself alone with my father while collecting firewood did he acknowledge what had happened. "You saw it," he stated simply. "Yes," I confirmed. "Exactly as you described." He nodded, his expression troubled. "Some aspects of reality resist conventional explanation. This doesn't mean we should abandon rationality, but rather recognize its limitations in certain contexts." "What do you think it is?" I asked. He considered carefully before responding. "I believe it represents a natural phenomenon currently beyond scientific understanding, perhaps related to electromagnetic properties of mineral deposits in the soil interacting with methane or other gases from decomposing vegetation. The bamboo might serve as a conductor for this energy." His explanation sounded rehearsed, as if he had spent decades constructing a framework that could accommodate his experience without contradicting his worldview. I chose not to challenge it directly. And the consistent height, the purposeful movement, the selective visibility that allows it to be seen through windows but not traced through the grove, all potentially explicable through atmospheric conditions and optical properties, he replied, though his tone lacked conviction. We completed our task in silence, each contemplating the gap between explanation and experience. That evening's celebration temporarily suspended these considerations as we engaged in traditional family activities, sharing meals and memories while strengthening intergenerational bonds. Yet throughout the festivities, I noticed how family members positioned themselves, always facing outward toward the surrounding forest, always maintaining awareness of exit routes, always ensuring that younger children remained within arm's reach of adults. Our celebration continued under unacknowledged vigilance, joy tempered by caution. The blue light did not reappear during our remaining stay, but its singular manifestation had irrevocably altered my perception of Rikon and the natural world. Some threshold had been crossed in my understanding, not toward superstition, but toward recognition that empirical frameworks might be insufficient to categorize all phenomena. The family gathering continued for 3 more days, with relatives gradually departing according to their various obligations and travel arrangements. By the end of the week, only my parents, grandmother, one uncle's family, and I remained at the property. The reduced population created a quieter atmosphere, allowing normal household routines to resume. On the morning of our 8th day in Rikon, I was helping Ida prepare lunch while my parents had gone to the village center to purchase supplies. My uncle and his wife had taken their children to visit relatives in a neighboring community, planning to return by evening. This left Ada and me alone in the house during the midday hours. The kitchen faced the rear of the property, with windows overlooking the expansive backyard, garden plots, and eventually the bamboo grove and forest beyond. While chopping vegetables, I occasionally glanced outside, instinctively monitoring the tree line after my experience with the blue light phenomenon. Around noon, Ida asked me to fetch water from the covered well located approximately 30 meters behind the house. This well, constructed by my grandfather decades earlier, supplemented the property's modern plumbing system and was still used for drinking water due to its exceptional clarity and taste. As I crossed the yard carrying empty vessels, I noticed movement near the old outhouse structure that stood at the property's edge. This small building, constructed of brick with a corrugated metal roof, had been replaced by indoor plumbing years ago, but remained standing primarily due to the difficulty of demolition. Its position, partially obscured by overgrown flowering bushes, made it barely visible from the main house. A man I didn't recognize stood beside the structure, appearing to examine its exterior. His clothing was unremarkable, dark trousers and a faded button-down shirt, but something about his posture struck me as unusual. He stood perfectly still, his attention fixed on the building with an intensity that seemed disproportionate to its mundane nature. Maintaining a cautious distance, I called out in Assamese, asking if he needed assistance. The man turned slowly toward me but offered no response. His face remained partially shadowed by the midday sun positioned behind him, preventing clear identification of his features. After an uncomfortably prolonged moment of silence, he raised his hand in what might have been greeting or dismissal before turning back toward the outhouse. Unsettled by the encounter, I completed my water collection quickly and returned to the house, informing Ada about the stranger on our property. "Describe him," she requested, her hands pausing their work with the dough she was kneading. I provided the limited details I had observed: approximate height, clothing, and unusual behavior. As I spoke, Ada's expression transitioned from curiosity to concern. "Stay inside," she instructed, wiping flour from her hands. "I'll call your uncle. He's visiting relatives in Dibrugarh," I reminded her. "They won't return until evening." She hesitated, clearly uncomfortable with the situation, but reluctant to appear alarmed. "Perhaps it's someone from the village checking the property boundaries," she suggested, though her tone conveyed doubt. "The land surveys are scheduled next month." "Should we call the local constable?" I asked. "Not yet," she decided. "First, we should verify if he's still there and determine his purpose." We moved to the kitchen window that provided the best view of the outhouse. The structure remained visible, but the man was no longer in sight. Aida retrieved an old pair of binoculars from a cabinet drawer, using them to scan the property perimeter. "I don't see anyone," she confirmed after a thorough survey. "But I don't like this. When your parents return, we'll have your father check the area properly." We returned to preparing lunch, though both maintained frequent visual checks through the windows. Approximately 20 minutes later, movement again caught my attention. The same figure, now standing directly beside the outhouse door, his hand positioned on the latch as if preparing to enter. "He's back," I alerted Aida, pointing toward the figure. She joined me at the window, binoculars raised. After focusing on the area, her complexion paled noticeably. "I see the outhouse," she said carefully. "But there's no one there." "That's impossible," I insisted. "He's standing right next to the door." "Dark clothes, same man as before." Ida handed me the binoculars without comment. When I raised them to my eyes and adjusted the focus, I experienced a moment of profound disorientation. Through the magnified view, the outhouse stood alone against the background of vegetation. No human figure was visible in the vicinity. Lowering the binoculars, I could clearly see the man with my unaided vision, still in the same position, now partially opening the outhouse door. When I raised the binoculars again, the area appeared unoccupied. "This isn't possible," I whispered, alternating between direct observation and binocular viewing several times with identical results each time. "Come away from the window," Ada instructed firmly, pulling me back from the glass. "Sit down." She guided me to a kitchen chair and poured a glass of water from the container I had recently filled. Her hands displayed slight trembling, but her voice remained steady. "What you're seeing has been reported before," she explained. Not frequently, but consistently over many years. Different observers, different times of day, always near that specific structure. What exactly am I seeing? I asked, struggling to reconcile the contradictory visual information. We don't know, she admitted. Some believe it's a visual disturbance caused by heat refraction or particular lighting conditions. Others suggest it represents something less conventional. You mean a ghost? The word felt childish as I spoke it. I mean a phenomenon that persists independently of individual perception, she corrected. The fact that it cannot be observed through magnifying devices suggests it may exist outside normal optical parameters. Her surprisingly technical explanation reminded me that Aida had been trained as a nurse before marriage. Her understanding of the world informed by both scientific education and traditional knowledge systems. A noise from the front of the house interrupted our conversation, my parents returning with supplies. Aida motioned for me to remain seated while she greeted them and explained the situation. I heard my father's concerned voice followed by determined footsteps as he moved through the house toward the rear door. Stay inside, he instructed firmly as he passed the kitchen. All of you. From the window, I watched him cross the yard with purposeful strides, a heavy walking stick gripped in his right hand. As he approached the outhouse, the figure, still visible to my unaided eye, turned toward him. For a moment, the two appeared to face each other across a distance of approximately 10 meters. Then, in a movement that defied natural human locomotion, the figure seemed to slide sideways and behind the structure without taking observable steps. My father increased his pace, circling the outhouse completely before examining the surrounding area and expanding perimeter checks. After several minutes of thorough investigation, he returned to the house. There's no one there, he confirmed, his expression troubled. No footprints in the soft ground, no disturbance to the spider webs across the outhouse door, no indication of recent human presence. But I saw him clearly, I insisted, even while you were out there. He moved behind the building when you approached. My father and Aida exchanged significant glances. You saw someone while I was conducting the search? He clarified. When I confirmed this, he sat heavily at the kitchen table, absently accepting the glass of water my mother offered. This matches previous reports, he acknowledged reluctantly. Incidents in 1992, 2001, and 2009 described similar observations. A male figure visible to some observers but not others, appearing near the outhouse, unable to be photographed or viewed through optical devices, leaving no physical evidence of presence. What is it? I asked directly. I don't know, my father admitted, the acknowledgement clearly difficult for him. The consistent reports suggest something beyond simple misidentification or hallucination, particularly since multiple unrelated observers have described nearly identical experiences over decades. The property was previously owned by a family that departed abruptly in the 1940s, Aida added. Local records indicate the male householder disappeared under unclear circumstances. When the remaining family members left the area, rumors suggested they were fleeing something associated with his disappearance. We maintained heightened vigilance throughout the afternoon. My uncle and his family returned early evening, and after being informed of the incident, insisted on conducting another thorough inspection of the property perimeter. No evidence of intrusion was discovered, and no further sightings occurred that day. That night, additional precautions were implemented, extra locks secured, improvised alarms placed at entry points, sleeping arrangements adjusted to ensure no one remained isolated. I shared a room with my younger cousins, ostensibly to provide supervision but equally for the psychological comfort of collective presence. Sleep came reluctantly, interrupted by the normal creaks and settling sounds of the old house that now carried new significance. Each acoustic anomaly prompted immediate alertness. Each shadow movement demanded rational explanation. The familiar childhood fear of darkness returned with amplified intensity, informed now by direct experience rather than abstract possibility. Morning brought temporary relief through daylight and resumed activity, but the incident had irrevocably altered my perception of the property. Spaces I had previously navigated without consideration now demanded conscious evaluation. The outhouse structure, once an overlooked relic of earlier domestic arrangements, became a focal point of avoidance, not through explicit instruction but instinctive aversion. My father, ever committed to rational investigation, spent considerable time researching historical records of the property and interviewing elderly village residents about local history. His inquiries yielded fragmented information about the previous owners, but no conclusive explanation for the recurring phenomenon. The most consistent account suggests the man disappeared while working on the outhouse construction, he reported after speaking with the village's oldest resident. His family reported him missing after he failed to return for the evening meal. A search found his tools beside the partially completed structure, but no indication of his whereabouts or fate. Could he have abandoned his family? My mother suggested. Perhaps staged a disappearance to begin a new life elsewhere. Possible, my father conceded, though it fails to explain why. Multiple unrelated observers report seeing a figure that matches no known current resident of the region. The incident was not discussed in detail again during our remaining stay, though its impact persisted in modified behaviors and heightened awareness. The outhouse structure became subject to unacknowledged collective avoidance. Routes through the yard were adjusted to maintain maximum distance. Necessary outdoor activities were conducted with multiple participants rather than individually. When we departed Rikon 10 days later, returning to our city residence and normal routines, the experience accompanied us as a persistent cognitive dissonance, an encountered phenomenon that resisted integration into conventional understanding of reality. Though we resumed urban patterns and professional obligations, something fundamental had shifted in our perception of the world's underlying structure. I found myself researching visual phenomena, quantum physics theories regarding perception, and historical accounts of similar experiences across cultural contexts. My academic focus expanded to include epistemological questions regarding the limitations of empirical verification methodologies. What constitutes valid observation when experience contradicts instrumentation? How should we categorize phenomena that demonstrate consistent patterns yet resist standard documentation procedures? These questions remained unresolved, periodic reminders of boundaries between known and unknown, between explicable and mysterious. The vanishing visitor of Rikon became not merely an anomalous experience, but a conceptual framework challenge, a persistent reminder that reality might encompass more than our established systems acknowledge. 2 days before our scheduled departure from Rikon, my uncle invited me to accompany him to a celebration in the neighboring village. A distant relative was hosting a traditional pre-wedding gathering, and my uncle thought the experience would provide insight into regional customs while offering a welcome distraction from the unsettling incidents at our property. The celebration began in late afternoon with traditional music, elaborate meals, and ceremonial exchanges between the families of the prospective bride and groom. Multiple generations participated in the festivities, which extended well into the evening hours. Despite my initial reluctance to leave our property after recent events, the immersive cultural experience proved engaging, temporarily displacing concerns about unexplained phenomena. Around 11 o'clock, my uncle indicated it was time to return home. Several guests offered to drive us, but my uncle declined, explaining that the narrow footpaths between villages provided a more direct route than the circuitous road system. He assured me the walk would take only 25 minutes and that he had made the journey countless times throughout his life. We departed with warm farewells, carrying a small lantern to illuminate our path. The night air carried a pleasant chill, filled with the scents of wood smoke, cultivated fields, and forest vegetation. For the first 10 minutes, our journey proceeded comfortably as we followed a well-established path between agricultural plots. My uncle pointed out constellations visible in the clear night sky, naming them in both Sanskrit and Assamese while explaining their significance in traditional agricultural calendars. As we approached the boundary between cultivated land and forest edge, where the path narrowed considerably, my uncle's conversational tone shifted subtly. His astronomical lecture tapered into silence, replaced by more frequent directional instructions and increased attention to our surroundings. The lantern, previously held at comfortable carrying height, was now raised higher to maximize the illuminated area ahead. "We're entering the connector path," he explained, his voice deliberately casual, though I detected underlying tension. "It runs parallel to the stream for approximately half a kilometer before reaching the road that leads to grandmother's property. The footing can be uneven, so watch your step carefully." The path indeed narrowed significantly, barely accommodating our side-by-side progress. Dense vegetation pressed close on either side, occasionally brushing against our clothing as we navigated the restricted space. Overhead, tree branches created a natural canopy that obscured the previously visible stars, intensifying the darkness beyond our lantern's limited radius. This section was originally created by wild elephants traveling between water sources, my uncle explained, maintaining conversation that seemed partially intended to assert human presence in the otherwise silent forest. Later, villagers expanded it for timber transportation and travel between communities. Approximately 5 minutes into this forested section, my uncle abruptly halted mid-sentence during a description of local woodcraft traditions. His posture stiffened noticeably as he turned his head slightly, adopting the characteristic attitude of intensified listening. "What is it?" I whispered, instinctively matching his suddenly reduced volume. He raised his hand for silence, continuing to focus his attention behind us. After several seconds of perfect stillness, he lowered the hand and resumed walking, though at a noticeably accelerated pace. "Probably nothing," he responded, though his tone contradicted the reassurance. "Forest animals are active at night. Let's continue." We proceeded at the increased speed for perhaps 2 minutes before he stopped again, this time turning completely to direct the lantern's beam along our back trail. The light revealed only the empty path winding between dark vegetation. "Uncle, what's wrong?" I asked, unable to identify any cause for his evident concern. He hesitated before responding. "I thought I heard footsteps behind us, a walking pattern that—" He paused, seeming to reconsider his explanation. "It's nothing. The forest creates acoustic anomalies. Sound travels differently between trees, especially at night." We resumed our journey with further increased urgency, no longer maintaining even pretense of casual progress. My uncle now held the lantern in his left hand, while his right remained free, occasionally touching the pocket where I knew he carried a folding knife, a practical tool for rural life that could serve protective functions if necessary. The third time he stopped. Approximately 3 minutes later, I also heard what had triggered his concern, a distinct footfall sound behind us, seemingly closer than would be expected given the empty trail revealed during our previous check. The sound pattern was peculiar, not the continuous rhythm of normal bipedal walking, but rather a singular, deliberate step followed by silence. "Someone's following us," I whispered, instinctively moving closer to my uncle. "Stay calm," he instructed quietly. "We're less than 10 minutes from the main road. Once there, we'll be within shouting distance of outlying houses." He raised the lantern, calling out in Assamese, "Who's there? Identify yourself." His voice echoed briefly among the trees before dissipating into silence. No response came from the darkness behind us. After waiting several seconds, he called again with identical results. "Perhaps an animal," he suggested, though his expression indicated he believed otherwise. "Let's continue, maintaining awareness but not allowing fear to overwhelm reason." We resumed walking, now at the maximum pace possible without actually running. The path conditions prevented outright sprinting. Exposed roots, occasional rocks, and unpredictable elevation changes demanded some attention to footing, even under urgent circumstances. The following footstep sound came more quickly this time, a single, heavy impact on the earthen path that suggested proximity within 20 meters behind us. The acoustic character seemed wrong somehow, too singular, too isolated, lacking the natural complementary sounds that would accompany normal human movement through forest undergrowth. My uncle abandoned pretense of calm assessment, switching the lantern to illuminate our forward path more effectively. "We need to increase our pace," he stated flatly. "The main road is just beyond that large banyan tree ahead. Once there, we turn right and proceed directly to populated areas." Before we could implement this plan, his phone chimed with an incoming message notification, an incongruously normal sound in our increasingly abnormal situation. He retrieved the device with his free hand, glancing at the screen. "No network signal," he noted with evident confusion. "Yet a message notification." As he spoke, the screen illumination died completely, the battery depleted despite having been fully charged before our departure. Simultaneously, our lantern dimmed significantly, its previously robust illumination fading to a weak glow barely sufficient to distinguish the path directly before us. The next footfall sound behind us was louder, closer, accompanied by something new, a subtle scraping quality that suggested dragging movement rather than clean stepping. My uncle made a quick decision, extinguishing our failing lantern completely. "Our eyes will adjust," he whispered. "The path is lighter colored than surrounding vegetation. Follow it directly. Do not look back. Do not stop regardless of what you hear." We proceeded in near total darkness, guided only by the marginally lighter coloration of the packed earth path against the black vegetation borders. My uncle began reciting what I recognized as a traditional protective prayer, his voice maintained at precisely the volume to be audible to me without projecting far into the surrounding forest. The footstep sounds continued behind us, maintaining a consistent distance despite our increasingly rapid movement. The acoustic pattern remained disturbing, single impacts followed by the dragging sound, suggesting some form of mobility impairment, yet capable of matching our accelerated pace. When the banyan tree appeared as a massive, darker shape against the night sky ahead, my uncle abandoned the prayer mid-sentence, instead instructing sharply, "Run, now, directly to the road and turn right. Don't stop until you reach the first house with lights." We broke into simultaneous sprinting, abandoning caution regarding footing hazards in favor of maximum speed. The footsteps behind us immediately accelerated, the singular impacts coming in rapid succession, interspersed with the scraping drag sound. An impossible locomotion pattern that suggested hopping on a single limb rather than normal bipedal movement. The distance to the banyan tree seemed to expand impossibly, the landmark remaining frustratingly distant despite our full-speed approach. My breath came in painful gasps, more from fear than exertion, as the pursuing footsteps maintained precise distance, neither falling behind nor overtaking, but rather pacing our desperate flight with unnatural precision. When we finally reached the tree and executed the right turn onto the wider main road, the pursuing sounds ceased abruptly. The transition from dense forest acoustics to open road created a sudden auditory vacuum. No footsteps, no dragging, only our own labored breathing and rapid footfalls on the packed dirt surface. My uncle maintained our pace for another 100 meters before gradually slowing, finally stopping near the first illuminated house along the roadside. He bent forward, hands braced on knees, drawing deep breaths before straightening to look back along our route. The road stretched empty in both directions, the banyan tree junction barely visible in the distance. What was that? I gasped when sufficient breath returned for speech. He shook his head slowly. Something that inhabits the boundary spaces. It rarely ventures onto main paths or populated areas. Usually it only makes its presence known, maintaining distance from humans. Usually, I prompted when he didn't continue. There have been incidents, he acknowledged reluctantly. Individuals traveling alone at night who reported being followed all the way to their destinations. Several described hearing it circling their homes throughout the night, attempting to gain entry through doors and windows. What happens if it succeeds? The question emerged before I could consider whether I truly wanted the answer. No verified accounts exist of such an outcome, he replied carefully. Those who reported the experiences survived to share their stories. The implication hung unspoken between us. Those who might have experienced worse outcomes were unavailable to provide testimony. We completed the remaining distance to grandmother's house in tense silence, repeatedly checking behind us despite the now populated route and occasional passing vehicles providing reassurance of civilization's proximity. Upon reaching the property, my uncle insisted on inspecting the house perimeter before allowing me to enter. Once inside, he immediately checked all doors and windows, reinforcing standard locks with additional improvised barriers. Only after completing these security measures did he share our experience with the other adults present. Their reactions revealed volumes, not surprise or disbelief, but rather grim acknowledgement, as if confirming a known danger rather than encountering novel information. My father immediately joined my uncle in a second inspection of the property boundaries, while my mother and aunt prepared hot tea with medicinal herbs traditionally associated with protection and recovery. Later that night, as I lay awake listening to the adults conversing in hushed tones downstairs, I processed the experience through multiple interpretative frameworks. The rational explanation suggested a human pursuer with malicious intent, perhaps deterred by our reaching more populated areas. Yet this failed to account for the distinctive movement pattern, the electronic malfunctions, and the precise pacing that maintained constant distance regardless of our speed variations. Alternative explanations entered territory I had previously dismissed. Traditional regional beliefs regarding forest entities that occupied threshold spaces between wild and cultivated lands, between natural and human domains. These conceptual frameworks, which I had categorized as cultural metaphors rather than literal descriptions, suddenly offered structural coherence to an experience that defied conventional categorization. Sleep eventually claimed me near dawn, bringing dreams filled with endless pursuit through increasingly narrow paths. The pursuing entity remained perpetually just beyond visual confirmation, its presence indicated only by that distinctive singular footfall, followed by the dragging sound, always approaching but never quite reaching me across the dreamscape's shifting geography. Morning brought physical exhaustion but mental clarity. Whatever had followed us through the forest represented a genuine phenomenon, whether human, animal, or something uncategorized within those binary options. The experience joined the accumulating evidence that Raikon's reputation for unusual occurrences reflected actual conditions rather than mere superstition or cultural narrative. My uncle avoided detailed discussion of the incident during daylight hours, particularly around younger family members. However, when I approached him privately while helping prepare the Jeep for our departure the following day, he offered limited additional context. It has been encountered for at least 4 generations, he explained while checking tire pressure. My grandfather documented multiple incidents in journals he maintained throughout his forestry career. The British administrators dismissed his reports as native superstition, but he maintained meticulous records including witness statements from colonial officials who experienced similar encounters. What did he believe it was? I asked, handing him tools as needed. He developed no conclusive theory, my uncle replied. But he noted patterns in the encounters. They occurred predominantly during specific lunar phases, involved primarily male travelers, and focused on paths that followed historical boundaries between tribal territories. This information provided no definitive explanation, but offered contextual framework. The phenomenon had historical continuity, geographical consistency, and documented patterns that transcended individual perception or cultural background. Whatever had followed us represented not an isolated incident, but rather a persistent aspect of Raikon's reality, acknowledged through generations despite changing social and educational contexts. Our departure the following day carried mixed emotions, relief at returning to familiar urban environments where unexplained phenomena seemed less prevalent, yet reluctance to leave questions unresolved. As our vehicle navigated the winding road away from the village, I found myself looking back not merely at the diminishing landscape, but at a conceptual boundary crossed during our stay. Had arrived in Raikon with the confident epistemological framework of contemporary education, a system that categorized traditional accounts of unusual phenomena as cultural constructs serving social cohesion functions, rather than descriptive reports. I departed with fundamental uncertainty about these categorical distinctions, having directly experienced events that resisted integration into conventional explanatory models. The blue light, the vanishing visitor, the single-footed pursuer, each incident presented empirical challenges to established understanding. Each suggested that reality might encompass elements currently beyond scientific categorization, without necessarily contradicting scientific principles. The experiences expanded rather than replaced my conceptual framework, adding complexity rather than substituting superstition for rationality. As Raikon receded behind us, I realized these experiences would accompany me regardless of geographical distance. They had permanently altered my perception of possibility, my evaluation of evidence, and my understanding of knowledge boundaries. The footsteps in the dark had followed me into a new conceptual territory from which no simple return journey existed. My return to university life after the Raikon visit proceeded with superficial normalcy. I attended lectures, completed assignments, participated in social activities, and maintained the expected routines of academic existence. Yet beneath this conventional surface, my intellectual focus had fundamentally shifted. Course material that previously seemed comprehensive now appeared conspicuously incomplete, failing to address experiential dimensions that resisted standard categorical frameworks. During the following summer break in 2019, I made an independent decision to return to Rikon. My parents expressed concern, preferring I accompany them on a planned family trip to relatives in Mumbai instead. However, I presented my return as an opportunity to assist Aita with property maintenance while conducting preliminary research for a potential anthropology project examining regional oral histories. After considerable negotiation, they reluctantly agreed to my 2-week stay with several conditions. I would check in daily via phone calls to the village center where reception was reliable. My uncle, who lived in a nearby town, would visit frequently, and I would adhere to strict safety protocols, including avoiding forest paths after sunset and maintaining secure household boundaries at all times. I arrived in Rikon during early June, when monsoon rains transformed the landscape into vibrant greens punctuated by blooming wildflowers. Aita welcomed me with characteristic warmth tempered by evident concern regarding my solitary arrival. After settling into my usual room, I outlined my plans to document local historical narratives while helping with seasonal property maintenance tasks. "Your interest in our stories is welcome," she commented while preparing afternoon tea. "But remember that recording and investigation are different from direct engagement. Some knowledge functions as warning rather than invitation." I assured her my approach would remain scholarly rather than experimental, though privately I harbored more complex intentions. Beyond documenting narratives, I hope to establish pattern recognition frameworks that might correlate environmental factors with reported phenomena. My rucksack contained equipment reflecting these objectives: a digital weather station, electromagnetic field detector, infrared thermometer, and high-sensitivity audio recorder. The first week passed uneventfully as I established daily routines of morning assistance with household tasks, afternoon interviews with village elders willing to share traditional accounts, and evening documentation of collected materials. My technological monitoring revealed nothing beyond normal environmental fluctuations, and no unusual incidents occurred on or near the property. On the 8th day of my stay, while reviewing interview notes from a particularly informative session with the village's traditional medicine practitioner, I noticed recurring references to a location described as the old worship place, or the stone circle, in various accounts of unusual occurrences. When I inquired about this location during subsequent interviews, I received conflicting geographical information accompanied by consistent advice to avoid the area entirely. My curiosity intensified when Aida entered the room during one such conversation and abruptly changed the subject when she overheard my questions about the stone circle. Later that evening, when we were alone preparing dinner, I raised the topic directly. "What can you tell me about the stone circle mentioned in several local accounts?" I asked while chopping vegetables. "It seems connected to multiple historical incidents, but no one provides consistent location details." Aida's knife paused over the fish she was preparing, her expression transitioning from surprise to resignation. "They provide inconsistent information deliberately," she acknowledged after a prolonged silence. "The location is approximately 2 kilometers northeast of this property, in a section of forest that was previously communal land before being incorporated into the protected forest reserve in the 1980s. Why discourage knowledge of its location?" I pressed. "Because historically, those who sought it out experienced disproportionate encounters with unexplained phenomena," she replied. "The site predates contemporary religious structures in the region. Archaeological assessment during the reserve establishment dated the stone arrangement to approximately 3,000 years ago, though the purpose remains unidentified. Is it dangerous physically? Unstable ground or hazardous wildlife?" I attempted to identify tangible rather than supernatural concerns. "The physical location presents no unusual dangers beyond normal forest conditions," she conceded. "The concerns relate to its apparent role as a focal point for the types of phenomena you've already encountered here." This confirmation that the site represented a potential research opportunity rather than merely local superstition cemented my determination to locate and document it. However, recognizing that direct disclosure of this intention would trigger active opposition, I allowed the conversation to transition to other topics while developing a strategy for independent investigation. The following morning, I informed Ida that I planned to photograph traditional architectural elements in the village for my research documentation. This legitimate activity provided cover for carrying my backpack with research and safety equipment while establishing an expected absence of several hours. I visited the village center as indicated, photographing interesting structural features while gradually working my way toward the northeastern forest edge. Upon reaching the forest boundary, I consulted topographical maps downloaded prior to my arrival, identifying several potential locations matching the limited geographical information I had gathered. The most promising site appeared to be situated on slightly elevated ground near a seasonal stream junction, a location that aligned with fragmented descriptions from multiple accounts. The forest transition occurred gradually, cultivated land giving way to increasingly dense vegetation as I followed a rarely used path that eventually disappeared entirely among undergrowth. Navigation required frequent compass checks and careful attention to topographical features corresponding to map indicators. Despite June humidity creating challenging hiking conditions, I maintained steady progress through the increasingly primary forest environment. Approximately 90 minutes into the forest section of my journey, the landscape began corresponding more precisely with descriptive elements from collected narratives. A seasonal stream appeared on my left, while the ground began a subtle but persistent upward slope. The vegetation transitioned from mixed species to predominantly older growth trees with significant canopy cover, reducing undergrowth and improving visibility. The first indicator of human modification appeared unexpectedly, a flat stone approximately 1 meter square, partially embedded in the forest floor, but displaying unmistakable tool marks on its upper surface. Several meters beyond, a similar stone emerged from the undergrowth, positioned at what appeared to be a deliberate angle relative to the first. Following this apparent alignment, additional worked stones became visible, creating a discernible pathway leading toward higher ground ahead. The path terminated in a small clearing where the tree canopy opened slightly, allowing dappled sunlight to illuminate what was unmistakably a human-created arrangement. 7 stone pillars, each approximately 1 meter high, formed an imperfect circle approximately 10 meters in diameter. At the circle's center stood a larger table-like stone structure supported by smaller base stones. The entire arrangement displayed significant weathering consistent with extreme age, yet the deliberate positioning remained unmistakable. The central table stone featured eroded markings that suggested intentional carving rather than natural erosion patterns. Most notably, the arrangement occupied the clearing's center with such precision that the dappled sunlight through the canopy opening illuminated the central, stone structure while leaving the perimeter pillars in partial shadow. I methodically documented the site through photographs and measurements, noting orientation relative to cardinal directions and potential astronomical alignments. The central stone table aligned precisely east-west, with more elaborately carved elements on the eastern edge. The perimeter stones, though superficially similar, displayed subtle size variations that corresponded to specific directional positions, suggesting functional rather than merely aesthetic purpose. After completing basic documentation, I unpacked, monitoring equipment to establish environmental baselines. Temperature readings revealed the circle's interior maintained approximately 3° cooler temperature than surrounding forest, despite identical sun exposure conditions. Electromagnetic field measurements showed subtle but measurable fluctuations when moving between perimeter stones, creating a pattern that defied simple explanation through geological or equipment factors. Most intriguing were audio recordings, which captured a persistent low-frequency sound at the circle's center that remained inaudible to direct human hearing but registered clearly on equipment. The sound maintained consistent amplitude regardless of intermittent wind or wildlife disturbances, suggesting its source was neither atmospheric nor biological. Time passed with surprising rapidity as I conducted these investigations. When I finally checked my watch, more than 3 hours had elapsed since arriving at the site. The afternoon was advancing, which would require expedited return to maintain my committed schedule with Ida. I began packing equipment while completing final observational notes. As I worked, a subtle shift in ambient conditions registered peripherally, a transitional quality to the light that suggested approaching weather rather than merely advancing afternoon. Looking upward through the canopy opening, I observed dark clouds accumulating with unusual rapidity, their formation patterns suggesting imminent precipitation. Having experienced regional monsoon dynamics previously, I recognized the signs of a potentially severe thunderstorm developing. Accelerating my departure preparations, I completed a final photographic sequence of the stone arrangement before shouldering my backpack. As I turned to retrace my entry path, a distinct cracking sound drew my attention back to the circle's center. The sound repeated, a sharp percussion like stone striking stone, though nothing visibly moved within the arrangement. The first raindrops began penetrating the canopy as I hesitated, uncertain whether to investigate this new phenomenon or prioritize departure ahead of deteriorating weather conditions. The decision was effectively made for me when multiple simultaneous lightning strikes illuminated the surrounding forest, followed almost immediately by thunderclaps that suggested dangerous proximity. I abandoned further investigation and began retracing my route with increased urgency. The rainfall intensified dramatically within minutes, transitioning from isolated drops to continuous sheets that reduced visibility and transformed the forest floor into increasingly slippery terrain. The previously subtle stream now carried significant flow volume, its crossing points becoming potentially hazardous. Navigation challenges intensified as natural light diminished under the combined effects of canopy density, storm clouds, and advancing afternoon. I maintained direction using compass readings protected within a waterproof case, but progress slowed considerably due to reduced visibility and increasingly treacherous footing. Approximately halfway back to the forest edge, I paused beneath a particularly dense canopy section that offered marginal protection from the heaviest rainfall. While consulting my map to verify position, I became aware of an anomalous sound, barely perceptible beneath the rainfall's constant percussion. A rhythmic tapping that suggested deliberate pattern rather than random natural occurrence. Initially attributing this to water droplets striking particular surfaces in sequence, I prepared to resume movement when the pattern changed distinctly, transitioning from regular intervals to what unmistakably represented a simple numerical sequence. 3 rapid taps, pause, 5 rapid taps, pause, followed by a single prolonged sound. This pattern repeated with precise timing, eliminating any reasonable attribution to random natural processes. More concerning was the sound's apparent directionality. It originated behind me, along the path leading back toward the stone circle, yet carried acoustic properties suggesting much closer proximity than the significant distance already traversed. Rational assessment suggested immediate continuation toward the forest edge and safety. However, investigative curiosity momentarily overrode this pragmatic response. I carefully extracted the audio recorder from my backpack, activated its highest sensitivity setting, and pointed the directional microphone toward the sound source. The recording level indicators immediately registered significant input, despite the environmental noise floor created by rainfall. When I rotated the device slowly through different directional alignments, the signal's strength peaked precisely. When aimed toward the stone circle location, though visible conditions verified nothing could be observed beyond a few meters in the dense vegetation and precipitation. The tapping pattern continued with mathematical precision, 3, 5, 1, repeating in cycles of exactly 12 seconds based on the recorder's time display. This precision eliminated wildlife or random environmental factors as plausible explanations, strongly suggesting intentional communication attempts. As I contemplated potential response protocols, the pattern abruptly ceased mid-sequence. The absence created a perceptual void more noticeable than the sound itself had been. This silence held for approximately 20 seconds before a new sound emerged, no longer tapping but rather what registered as bipedal movement through undergrowth, approaching along the path from the circle direction. The movement pattern contained the distinctive asymmetry I had encountered previously, the singular footfall followed by dragging sound that had pursued my uncle and me months earlier. However, this manifestation differed in one critical aspect. Rather than maintaining consistent distance, it was unambiguously approaching with increasing proximity. I secured the still recording device in an external backpack pocket and resumed movement toward the forest edge with maximum possible speed given the hazardous conditions. The pursuing sounds accelerated correspondingly. Maintaining relative distance reduction that suggested interception before reaching the forest boundary would be mathematically probable. The rainfall intensity increased further, transitioning from merely heavy to torrential. Water accumulated on the forest floor, creating impromptu channeling that transformed portions of the return path into flowing streams. These conditions simultaneously impeded my progress while potentially obscuring audio detection of the pursuing entity's movements. When I reached the seasonal stream crossing, now transformed into a substantial water flow, I faced a critical decision point. The direct route required crossing increasingly hazardous water, while a deviation would add significant distance through potentially disorienting forest sections. The pursuing sounds, though partially masked by rainfall and flowing water, remained detectable and continued indicating reducing distance. I opted for the water crossing, reasoning that the flowing stream might create a boundary barrier based on previous encounter patterns, suggesting the entity avoided certain threshold transitions. The crossing itself proved physically challenging. Water depth reached mid-thigh at the center point, with significant current force requiring careful navigation using tree roots and embedded rocks as stabilization points. Upon reaching the opposite bank and ascending to firmer ground, I paused briefly to verify position and assess pursuit status. The asymmetrical movement sounds had ceased at the stream edge, supporting my threshold barrier theory. However, as I prepared to resume progress, a new manifestation emerged. The blue light phenomenon previously encountered near the property now appeared approximately 30 meters downstream, hovering stationary above the water surface. Unlike its prior appearance near the bamboo grove, this manifestation displayed subtle variations, the color shifting between azure and deeper cobalt, while the perfectly spherical shape occasionally elongated vertically before returning to standard configuration. Most significantly, rather than maintaining fixed elevation above ground level, it adjusted position precisely relative to the water surface despite the stream's fluctuating levels. The light remained stationary for approximately 15 seconds before beginning lateral movement along the stream course, not in my direction but parallel to the water flow. This movement pattern continued for perhaps 30 meters before the light abruptly ascended vertically, hovered momentarily above the canopy, then descended into forest on the same side of the stream where I currently stood. This behavior suggested potential circumnavigation of the water barrier, creating renewed urgency to reach the forest boundary and agricultural land beyond. I resumed movement at maximum sustainable pace, no longer attempting silent progress, but rather prioritizing speed over stealth. The rainfall provided natural cover for movement sounds while I focused on maintaining correct directional heading through increasingly limited visibility conditions. The forest edge transition appeared with unexpected suddenness, dense vegetation yielding to cultivated land with disorientating abruptness. The rainfall maintained intensity across this boundary, but improved visibility on the open agricultural land provided significant psychological relief. I crossed the cultivated area rapidly, reaching the village outskirts as the storm's intensity finally began diminishing. Upon reaching Ida's house, I discovered significant concern regarding my extended absence, exacerbated by the severe weather conditions. My soaked appearance and evident exhaustion prompted immediate practical response: dry clothing, hot beverages, and solicitous attention before any questioning regarding my activities commenced. When interrogation inevitably began, I provided partially accurate information, acknowledging I had ventured into the forest edge to photograph distinctive flora while being caught unexpectedly by the rapidly developing storm. This explanation, while technically true, omitted the specific destination and subsequent experiences. Aida's expression suggested skepticism regarding this limited disclosure, but she refrained from direct confrontation. That evening, after basic recovery from the physical exertion, I reviewed the audio recordings captured during the return journey. The tapping pattern registered with remarkable clarity despite environmental interference, its mathematical precision evident when visualized through audio analysis software. More disturbing was the subsequent movement recording, which contained not only the asymmetrical locomotion sounds, but also intermittent vocalization components outside normal human speech frequency ranges. Most significant was a recording segment captured during my momentary pause after crossing the stream, a section containing no sounds I consciously perceived at the time. yet clearly registering on the equipment. Beneath the rainfall audio and my own breathing, a voice-like sound articulated something approximating words, though in no language I recognized. The vocal quality suggested neither male nor female categorization, but rather something outside standard classification parameters. I maintained this recording evidence privately, recognizing that sharing it would potentially reveal my unauthorized visitation of the Stone Circle site. Instead, I focused subsequent investigation on historical documentation of the location, utilizing Ida's limited book collection and conversations with village elders who might provide context without realizing my direct experience. These inquiries yielded fragmented information suggesting the site predated currently practiced regional religions, potentially representing indigenous belief systems subsequently displaced by arriving Hindu, Buddhist, and later Islamic influences. Several accounts suggested the location had been deliberately abandoned rather than naturally falling into disuse, the result of specific incidents rather than gradual cultural transition. Most notably, a journal excerpt written by a British colonial administrator in 1887 described the site as a primitive worship arrangement, apparently devoted to entities neither divine nor demonic by local classification, but rather representing forces associated with geographical features and transitional spaces between established domains. The administrator noted that local populations universally avoided the location despite no official prohibitions, based on accounts of perceptual distortions and temporary disappearances experienced by previous visitors. My final days in Rikon passed without further unusual incidents, though I maintained heightened awareness of environmental conditions and potential manifestations. The audio recording remained unexplained, yet undeniably documented, empirical evidence of phenomena that transcended conventional categorization systems. Upon returning to university life, I approached my studies with fundamentally altered perspective. Fields previously considered distinct, anthropology, physics, psychology, linguistics now appeared artificially segregated, their boundaries representing academic convenience rather than natural divisions in phenomenological reality. The Stone Circle experience, combined with previous Rikon encounters, suggested a complex reality where human perceptual systems interfaced imperfectly with environmental aspects currently beyond scientific instrumentation or theoretical frameworks. The experiences represented not supernatural manifestations, but rather natural phenomena exceeding current categorization systems, the contemporary equivalent of electromagnetic radiation before scientific understanding provided explanatory frameworks. Most significantly, these experiences permanently altered my fundamental epistemological assumptions regarding knowledge acquisition and verification methodologies. Direct experience, while subjectively compelling, required objective documentation through multiple methodologies. Yet simultaneously, technological documentation without experiential context provided incomplete data representation. The integration of these seemingly contradictory approaches became my private research focus, developing multidisciplinary methodologies for investigating phenomena at the boundaries of established knowledge domains. The abandoned shrine had offered momentary glimpses into these boundary spaces, suggesting that what we dismiss as unexplainable may simply await more sophisticated investigative frameworks. The academic year following my independent Rikon investigation proceeded with apparent normalcy. I maintained strong performance in university coursework while developing a reputation among professors for asking challenging interdisciplinary questions that occasionally extended beyond their specialized expertise. My formal studies focused on cultural anthropology with supplementary coursework in comparative religion, environmental science, and signal processing, an unconventional combination that raised occasional administrative eyebrows but remained within acceptable program parameters. By December 2019, I had established a methodical documentation system for cataloging and cross-referencing the Rikon accounts. This private research project remained separate from my academic work, though it increasingly influenced my formal study approaches. The system correlated witness descriptions, environmental conditions, geographical locations, and temporal patterns across multiple reports spanning decades. When winter break approached, my parents expressed concern regarding my evident intention to return to Rikon. My previous independent visit and subsequent intense interest in regional history had triggered parental worry about unhealthy obsession. After careful negotiation, we reached compromise. I would accompany them to Rikon for the traditional family gathering, but agree to continuous family accompaniment during any research activities. We arrived at Ada's house in late December, finding the property much as it had remained through generations. The familiar rhythms of preparation for the family gathering provided comforting structure, cleaning rarely used rooms, preparing traditional foods, arranging sleeping accommodations for the expected relatives. Throughout these activities, I maintained awareness of subtle protective practices embedded within apparently mundane tasks, specific arrangements of certain plants near entrances, careful attention to threshold spaces, traditional markings renewed on door frames. 3 days after our arrival, with most extended family members now present, I experienced the first unusual incident of this visit. Around 2 in the morning, having fallen asleep while reading research materials, I awoke suddenly with the distinct impression of being observed. The room remained dark except for moonlight filtering through partially closed shutters, creating angular patterns across the wooden floor. Initial visual survey revealed nothing unusual within the bedroom. The door remained closed as I had left it, windows secured against the winter night chill. Yet the sensation of presence persisted with unusual intensity. Not generalized anxiety, but rather specific awareness focused on the room's far corner where shadows gathered most densely. As my vision adapted fully to the low light conditions, subtle movement registered within that corner. Not physical displacement, but rather a quality suggesting three-dimensional depth where the room's actual dimensions permitted none. The shadow appeared to extend beyond the wall's physical boundary, creating an impression of spatial anomaly rather than simply darkness. I remained motionless, documenting observations mentally with the systematic approach developed through previous encounters. The shadow maintained its position while developing increased definition, transitioning from amorphous darkness to a roughly anthropomorphic silhouette, suggesting a figure approximately adult size, though proportionally incorrect. In subtle ways I could not precisely identify. Most notably, the manifestation produced no sound, no breathing, no movement noises, no interaction with the physical environment despite its apparent solidity. Room temperature remained stable based on subjective assessment, contradicting common reported experiences involving temperature reduction during similar manifestations. After approximately 40 seconds of mutual observation, I carefully reached toward the bedside lamp, maintaining visual contact with the anomaly throughout the movement. My hand had nearly reached the switch when the shadow executed a fluid lateral movement unlike normal human locomotion, transitioning from corner position to a location adjacent to my closed bedroom door, in a single continuous motion that traversed the intervening space without crossing it. This new position effectively blocked the room's only exit, creating a situation that objectively should have triggered fear response. Instead, I experienced intense analytical curiosity accompanied by awareness that previous Rikon manifestations had demonstrated observation and approach behaviors without actual physical interaction with witnesses. "I can see you," I stated calmly, employing normal conversational volume. "I've documented your previous manifestations near the property." The shadow exhibited no response to auditory communication, maintaining its position without discernible reaction. After approximately 20 seconds of continued mutual observation, I repeated the communication in Assamese rather than English, considering potential regional specificity in the manifestation's perceptual processing. This linguistic shift produced immediate reaction. The shadow figure executed a rapid vertical expansion followed by horizontal compression, its proportions distorting in ways that defied anatomical possibility. The resulting configuration suggested attention or potential response capability rather than threat display. "What are you?" I asked in Assamese, maintaining calm intonation despite accelerated heart rate. The figure responded with further configurational change, developing increased definition in its upper portion while the lower section maintained amorphous characteristics. Most notably, what appeared to be a head-like structure oriented directly toward my position, though no facial features or specific anatomical details manifested within the shadowy substance. I continued systematic documentation through verbal classification, stating, "You've been observed near the bamboo grove as a light manifestation, near the abandoned bathroom structure in apparent human form, and on forest paths as an auditory phenomenon with distinctive movement pattern. At the specific mention of the bathroom structure, the figure executed a sharp rotational movement, momentarily expanding to nearly ceiling height before contracting to approximately 1 meter total height. This transformational response suggested either specific trigger recognition or communicative intention through configurational adjustment. Pursuing this apparent responsiveness, I inquired, "Are you attempting communication?" The shadow maintained its reduced height configuration while developing a rhythmic undulation along its perimeter. Not random movement, but rather patterned fluctuation suggesting deliberate signaling. The pattern completed 3 full cycles before stabilizing into stationary configuration again. I reached slowly toward my phone on the bedside table, intending to activate its recording capability. As my hand approached the device, the shadow executed another transition, not toward me, but rather toward the closed window, passing through the physical shutters without disturbing them, and disappearing from the room entirely. Immediately following its departure, room conditions normalized completely. The corner resumed proper spatial dimensions. The previously perceived depth anomaly resolved, and the distinctive observational sensation dissipated. I activated my phone's recording function despite the manifestation's departure, documenting verbal description of the entire encounter with timestamp reference and sequential observations. After completing this documentation, I made careful examination of the room's physical conditions. The corner where the manifestation originally appeared showed no temperature differential, no structural anomalies, and no residual effects of any kind. Similarly, the door area and window through which it departed displayed no evidence of interaction or passage. Rather than immediately sharing this experience with family members and potentially triggering protective responses that would limit investigation opportunities, I documented the encounter in my research journal with detailed observational notes. Most significant was the apparent recognition response to specific location references and the potential communicative intention shown through configurational changes. The following day proceeded normally, with family gathering activities occupying most hours. I maintained careful environmental monitoring throughout the property, utilizing both technological instruments and observational vigilance. No unusual readings or manifestations occurred during daylight hours, supporting the temporal pattern identified in previous documentation, phenomena predominantly manifesting during boundary transition periods, particularly night hours between midnight and pre-dawn. That evening, I prepared methodically for potential recurrence. Without explicitly indicating intentions to family members, I arranged my room to facilitate both documentation and interaction. The furniture configuration was adjusted to eliminate dense shadow areas while maintaining clear sight lines to all corners. Recording devices were positioned strategically but unobtrusively. Smartphone with extended battery pack, dedicated audio recorder with infrasound capability, and a small infrared temperature sensor connected to data logging equipment. I maintained normal evening social activities with family members before retiring at the conventional time, though with no intention of sleeping. Instead, I positioned myself comfortably against the headboard with a book as natural justification for remaining awake while the recording equipment operated continuously. Hours passed without incident. The house gradually settled into nighttime silence, occasional creaking from thermal expansion and contraction providing the only auditory input to the recording devices. Temperature readings showed normal fluctuation patterns, consistent with winter night conditions in a structure with limited insulation. At approximately 2:17 a.m. according to log data, the first anomalous reading appeared, a rapid 4-degree temperature decrease localized near the window area. This occurred despite no detectable draft or air movement that would explain such thermal variation. Within the next 3 minutes, a distinctive temperature gradient developed across the room, with the coldest point migrating slowly from window toward the same corner where the previous night's manifestation had originated. Maintained outward appearance of reading while systematically monitoring these instrumental indications. At approximately 2:26 a.m., the audio equipment registered infrasound, frequencies significantly outside normal house, settlement range, a sustained tone at 14 Hz gradually increasing in amplitude though, remaining below human auditory perception threshold. The shadow manifestation appeared at precisely 2:30 a.m., materializing not gradually but rather through immediate presence. transitioning from absence to existence without intermediate development. Its initial configuration matched the reduced height version from the previous encounter's conclusion, positioned in the same corner despite my furniture rearrangement specifically designed to eliminate that shadow space. "You've returned," I stated in Assamese, maintaining conversational tone while activating additional recording functions through concealed switch beneath my blanket. I anticipated this might occur. The figure executed the now familiar perimeter undulation, completing exactly 3 cycles before stabilizing. This consistent pattern suggested intentionality rather than random response, potentially indicating established communication protocol from its perspective. "I've arranged documentation methods," I continued, gesturing toward visible recording devices while maintaining transparency regarding my actions. "These will help me understand your manifestation parameters." The shadow responded with vertical elongation followed by horizontal compression, matching its previous configurational response to directed communication. Most notably, it maintained precise position within the corner without approaching further into the room, behavior suggesting boundary recognition or limitation. "Are you the same entity observed in multiple forms throughout this property?" I inquired, establishing baseline identity parameters essential for coherent investigation. The manifestation executed a new movement pattern, lateral expansion followed by central contraction, creating momentarily donut-like configuration before returning to anthropomorphic silhouette. This unique response suggested either affirmative indication or inability to process identity categorization as presented. I continued systematic inquiry, asking, "Can you manipulate physical objects within this environment?" No configurational change followed this question. Instead, after approximately 10 seconds of apparent assessment, the nearby curtain exhibited slight movement despite closed windows and no perceptible air current. The fabric displaced approximately 3 centimeters laterally before returning to resting position. Simultaneously, the temperature sensors registered further 3-degree decrease specifically in that location. This demonstration of environmental interaction capability represented significant escalation from previous observational manifestations. I maintained calm analytical approach despite justified apprehension regarding potential activity expansion. "Thank you for that demonstration," I acknowledged. "Could you indicate your purpose in these visitations?" The shadow executed its most dramatic configurational change yet, rapidly expanding outward in all directions simultaneously while maintaining central mass cohesion. This expansion continued until the manifestation occupied approximately 60% of visible wall space before contracting with equal rapidity to its original dimensions. Throughout this dramatic display, audio equipment registered increasing infrasound amplitude while temperature sensors documented corresponding thermal reduction throughout the expansion field. Following this display, the manifestation initiated movement toward my position, not the fluid lateral transition previously observed, but rather conventional incremental advancement across the floor. This approach continued until approximately 2 meters separated my position from the still amorphous figure. At this distance, a new manifestation characteristic developed, extremely localized visual distortion in the space immediately surrounding the shadow. This distortion affected light passing through that spatial area, creating subtle prismatic effects where moonlight from the window intersected the phenomenon's perimeter. "Are you attempting direct communication?" I inquired, maintaining external composure despite elevated physiological response indicators. The shadow ceased forward movement, executing instead a vertical alignment shift that positioned its head-like upper section precisely level with my seated eyeline. In this configuration, the central mass developed subtle rhythmic pulsation, synchronized with the infrasound frequency documented by recording equipment. As this pulsation continued, I experienced gradual onset of unusual perceptual effects, slight visual trailing when shifting gaze, minor proprioceptive disconnection between intended and executed small movements, and most notably, progressive alteration in sound processing. Normal ambient sounds, house settling, distant animal calls through the window, my own breathing, developed echo-like quality with millisecond delay between initial perception and secondary processing. Recognizing potential consciousness alteration either through infrasound exposure or undocumented manifestation effects, I implemented pre-established grounding protocol, physical contact with documented room elements while verbally identifying them. This practice restored normal perceptual processing while maintaining observational continuity. Your presence affects human consciousness, I stated, documenting this observation verbally for recording purposes. Is this intentional communication methodology or incidental effect of your manifestation properties? The shadow responded with immediate configurational collapse, transitioning from anthropomorphic silhouette to amorphous darkness concentrated near floor level. In this reduced state, the associated perceptual effects diminished correspondingly while temperature began normalizing throughout the room. After approximately 20 seconds in this collapsed configuration, the manifestation initiated reconstitution, gradually developing vertical extension and proportional distribution, approximating its previous form. As physical coherence re-established, the shadow executed 3 complete rotational movements before stabilizing in original orientation. This complex response sequence suggested sophisticated reaction to the inquiry, potentially indicating adjustment of manifestation parameters to reduce perceptual impact while maintaining presence. Such adaptive response strongly indicated intelligence rather than random energy pattern, though whether conscious entity or automatic system remained undetermined. Thank you for modifying your presentation, I acknowledged. This helps facilitate communication without consciousness interference. The manifestation maintained stable configuration following this acknowledgement, the absence of further adjustment potentially indicating achievement of intended interaction parameters. The reduced influence on environmental conditions, stabilized, temperature readings and decreased infrasound amplitude supported this assessment for approximately 17 minutes according to recorded data. We maintained this arrangement. The shadow figure positioned 2 meters from my location, my seated position against the headboard, mutual observation without further configurational changes or environmental effects. During this period, I periodically verbalized observational notes to maintain documentation while monitoring instrumental readings for any subtle variations. At precisely 3:07 a.m., the manifestation initiated departure sequence without apparent triggering event. The shadow executed final rotational movement before beginning lateral transition toward the corner opposite its original appearance location. Unlike previous fluid motion across intermediate space, this movement followed conventional room geography, proceeding along wall perimeters rather than direct trajectory. Upon reaching the destination corner, the manifestation executed vertical elongation until contacting ceiling level, maintained this extended configuration for approximately 10 seconds, then rapidly contracted toward floor level before disappearing entirely. Final instrument readings showed immediate normalization of all environmental parameters coincident with visual disappearance. I maintained recording and observation protocols for an additional hour, documenting absence of further manifestations and gradual return to baseline room conditions. Throughout this period, no additional anomalous readings appeared on any monitoring equipment, suggesting complete departure rather than transformed presence. The following morning, I conducted thorough analysis of collected data before family members awoke. Audio recordings captured both my verbal documentation and the infrasound frequencies associated with the manifestation, though no conventionally audible sounds originated from the entity itself. Temperature logs showed precise correlation between manifestation positions and thermal variations, creating mappable patterns that traced its movements throughout the encounter. Most significantly, video recording through my smartphone documented significant portions of the interaction, though with notable limitations. The manifestation appeared on video as amorphous darkness, rather than the defined anthropomorphic shape visible to direct perception. Additionally, the prismatic light effects and spatial distortion remained absent in recorded format, suggesting some manifestation properties existed outside standard electromagnetic documentation parameters. This evidence collection represented unprecedented documentation of phenomena previously recorded only through subjective witness accounts. The objective verification of environmental effects, temperature variations, infrasound generation, and at least partial visual documentation established minimum parameters for phenomenon classification, regardless of ultimate explanation. After careful consideration, I decided to share limited information with my father, whose scientific background might provide valuable analytical perspective, while his personal experiences in Rikon offered contextual understanding. I approached him during morning tea while other family members were occupied with breakfast preparation. "I need to discuss something I experienced last night," I began carefully. "It relates to the phenomena you've previously encountered here." His expression registered immediate understanding, transitioning from casual morning conversation to focused attention. "You had an encounter," he stated rather than asked. "What form did it take?" I provided concise description of the shadow manifestation while emphasizing the documentation methods employed and resultant evidence collection. His initial skepticism visibly diminished as I detailed the correlation between subjective observations and instrument readings, particularly the synchronized temperature fluctuations and infrasound generation. "You have recordings?" he confirmed, professional scientific interest overriding paternal concern. I nodded, retrieving my phone to display selected video segments while summarizing the limitations of conventional documentation technologies when applied to the phenomenon. As he viewed the material, his expression reflected the familiar cognitive dissonance I had experienced during my first Riken encounters, the conflict between established understanding, frameworks and empirical evidence that resisted conventional categorization. "The documentation appears methodologically sound," he acknowledged after careful review. "The temperature variations particularly suggest physical, rather than purely perceptual phenomenon." "The entity demonstrated environmental interaction capability," I added, describing the curtain movement demonstration, limited but verifiable physical effect generation. He considered this information carefully before responding. "This represents significant escalation from previous manifestation patterns. Historical accounts describe primarily observational presence without direct interaction or communication attempts. Could this indicate evolving capabilities?" I suggested, or perhaps response to systematic documentation efforts rather than fear-based reactions. "Both possibilities merit consideration," he agreed. "Though a third option exists, you've encountered a different phenomenon category entirely, one that superficially resembles previously documented manifestations while possessing distinct properties. This possibility had not occurred to me, despite extensive classification efforts. The assumption of unified phenomenon behind diverse manifestations might represent investigation bias rather than actual condition. Multiple distinct anomalies operating within the same geographical location could present as related phenomena despite potentially independent origins. If multiple phenomenon types exist locally, I reasoned, that suggests either coincidental concentration of unrelated anomalies or some underlying environmental factor attracting or generating diverse manifestations. "The stone circle you visited against explicit advice," my father noted with surprising directness, "has historically been considered a focal point for such concentrated activity." His knowledge of my unauthorized expedition initially startled me before logical deduction provided explanation. Ida had likely shared her suspicions regarding my extended absence during the storm. Rather than denying this accurate assessment, I acknowledged the connection. "The site demonstrates unusual properties even through conventional measurement," I confirmed. "Temperature differentials, electromagnetic anomalies, and infrasound generation similar to what I documented last night." Instead of delivering expected parental reprimand regarding risk-taking behavior, my father shifted into collaborative analytical mode. "The British colonial records mention similar shadow manifestations specifically associated with that location," he noted. "Described as sentinels or guardians rather than threatening entities, though direct interaction was reportedly discouraged by local guides." This historical context expanded potential interpretative frameworks considerably. If the shadow represented not random energy manifestation but rather specific functionality associated with the ancient site, its behavioral patterns might indicate purpose rather than merely phenomenological characteristics. Could these manifestations represent some form of perimeter monitoring system? I suggested developing this functional hypothesis. The various forms documented throughout the property might serve as observation mechanisms reporting back to central location. An intriguing if speculative interpretation, my father acknowledged. Though it presupposes technological capability beyond conventional understanding, potentially employing principles currently beyond scientific categorization. Our discussion continued through various explanatory frameworks, from psychological projection theories to conventional electromagnetic phenomena to more esoteric possibilities involving consciousness interaction with environmental energy systems. Throughout this exchange, the collaborative analytical approach transcended traditional parent-child dynamics, establishing peer-level consideration of evidence and interpretative models. As family activities resumed around us, we concluded with agreement regarding continued documentation protocols. I would maintain systematic recording of any further manifestations while implementing additional measurement methodologies. My father would contribute historical research through academic connections, potentially providing contextual information regarding similar phenomena reported in comparable geographical settings. The midnight visitor had transformed from merely unsettling encounter to documented research, subject to not diminishing its profound implications, but rather placing the experience within investigative framework that might eventually yield understanding. This transitional perspective represented perhaps the most significant development in my relationship with Raikon's phenomena, the evolution from fear-based response to systematic study of boundary conditions where conventional reality frameworks encountered their limitations. The final days of our family gathering passed without further direct manifestations, though subtle environmental anomalies continued throughout the property. Momentary temperature fluctuations, occasional electromagnetic disruptions affecting electronic devices, and periodic infrasound bursts registered on monitoring equipment but below human perceptual threshold. These phenomena maintain patterns consistent with previous documentation, suggesting ongoing background activity without direct interaction attempts. My departure from Raikon following the holiday period carried mixed emotions, analytical frustration at leaving an active research environment, yet psychological relief from the constant vigilance such investigation required. I returned to university studies with enhanced theoretical frameworks for approaching conventional academic material, perceiving implicit boundary conditions and unstated assumptions within established disciplines. The experiences at Raikon progressively informed my academic trajectory, guiding course selections and research focus toward interdisciplinary methodologies capable of addressing phenomena at conventional knowledge boundaries. My formal studies maintained traditional anthropological focus, examining how different cultures categorize and interpret unusual experiences, while private research explored instrumentation development for documenting phenomena currently considered subjective or anecdotal. Over subsequent years, I developed increasingly sophisticated approaches for investigating Raikon's phenomena. Each vacation period brought me back to the property with enhanced methodologies and expanded conceptual frameworks. My family, having transitioned from protective concern to cautious support, facilitated these research visits while maintaining reasonable safety protocols. By 2021, I had established a comprehensive documentation system incorporating multiple complementary approaches. 1. Conventional scientific instrumentation measuring environmental parameters including temperature gradients, electromagnetic field fluctuations, infrasound generation, and barometric microvariations. Psychological assessment protocols measuring subjective experience characteristics, perceptual alterations, and cognitive processing changes during and following anomalous encounters. 3. Cultural historical documentation connecting contemporary experiences with historical accounts through consistent descriptive parameters and geographical correlation. 4. Theoretical modeling examining pattern consistencies across manifestation types, identifying potential unified principles underlying apparently diverse phenomena. This systematic approach yielded preliminary categorization frameworks suggesting Raikon's unusual occurrences represented not random anomalies, but rather structured phenomenon categories with distinct characteristics. The blue light manifestations demonstrated consistent properties regardless of observer: precise spherical configuration, azure coloration with occasional spectral variation, horizontal movement along established paths, and elimination of normal acoustic indicators that would accompany physical passage through vegetation. These properties suggested energy projection rather than physical entity, potentially utilizing natural geographical features as transmission conduits. The anthropomorphic manifestations, both the vanishing visitor near the outhouse and the shadow entity in my bedroom, shared configurational similarities despite apparent differences in presentation solidity. Both demonstrated awareness of observer presence, responsive behavior adjustments, and consistent manifestation locations. Their properties suggested boundary, interface phenomena, entities operating at intersection points between conventional physical space and adjacent dimensional configurations. The forest pursuit experiences, characterized by asymmetrical movement patterns and electronic disruption capability, presented the most overtly interactive phenomena category. These manifestations demonstrated apparent intentionality, geographical boundary recognition, avoiding crossing certain thresholds, and sensory manipulation effects on observers. Their characteristics suggested potential sentinel functionality, responsive to human incursion into specific territorial parameters. The stone circle location represented apparent focal point for heightened manifestation probability and intensity. Its consistent environmental anomalies, even in absence of visible phenomena, suggested persistent boundary condition thinning, a localized alteration in conventional physical parameters facilitating interaction between normally separate reality frameworks. These categorization efforts, while necessarily provisional given limited instrumentation capabilities and inherent observational challenges, provided structural framework for understanding Raikon's phenomena beyond mere unexplained occurrences. The pattern suggested functional systems, operating according to principles currently outside conventional scientific paradigms, but potentially subject to future integration through expanded theoretical models. My final visit to Raikon during this research period occurred in November 2022. Unlike previous methodological investigations, this journey carried specific intentionality, direct engagement with the shadow manifestation that had demonstrated the most sophisticated communication capability. Rather than merely documenting occurrence parameters, I designed interaction protocols intended to establish consistent communication methodology. Arriving at Aida's house during seasonal transition period when manifestation frequency historically peaked, I established comprehensive monitoring systems throughout the property. With my family's knowledge and cautious support, I prepared the primary bedroom as controlled research environment, eliminating variable factors while maximizing documentation capability through redundant systems. For 3 consecutive nights, I maintained vigilance without manifestation occurrence. Environmental readings showed subtle anomalous patterns consistent with background activity, but no direct interaction attempts. On the 4th night, following systematic invitation protocols conducted at the stone circle location earlier that day, the anticipated phenomenon finally appeared. The shadow manifestation materialized at precisely midnight, emerging not from room corners as in previous encounters, but rather through apparent dimensional intersection directly in the room's center. This novel manifestation method produced distinctive instrumental readings, simultaneous electromagnetic pulse, infrasound generation, and symmetrical temperature reduction radiating outward from central appearance point. Unlike previous manifestations, the entity immediately adopted stable anthropomorphic configuration, maintaining consistent proportional dimensions without the fluid transformations that had characterized earlier encounters. This configurational stability suggested intentional communication preparation rather than reactive presence. "I recognize you from previous interactions," I stated in Assamese, initiating established communication protocol. "Your manifestation parameters indicate potential response to invitation procedures conducted today." The shadow executed single, complete rotation, a movement pattern, documented in previous encounter as apparent acknowledgement gesture. Following this rotation, it projected directional intention toward specific instrumentation components, suggesting awareness of monitoring systems and their functional purposes. "The recording devices document our interaction for analysis purposes," I explained, maintaining transparent communication regarding methodologies and intentions. "They help establish consistent communication parameters across encounters." The manifestation responded by generating localized electromagnetic field fluctuation that affected specific equipment components without disrupting others, a display of precise environmental interaction capability rather than general energetic disruption. This selective effect demonstrated sophisticated discrimination ability, suggesting comprehensive awareness of technological functionality. For approximately 40 minutes, we engaged in progressively structured communication attempts. The shadow responded to specific inquiry types through consistent movement patterns, environmental effect generation, and configurational adjustments. Through systematic correlation between questions and responses, preliminary communication protocol emerged, specific rotational movements indicating affirmative negative responses, dimensional expansion contraction suggesting quantitative assessment, and selective electromagnetic interaction indicating subject matter relevance. Most significantly, the manifestation demonstrated apparent comprehension regarding theoretical models I verbally described, responding with precisely timed confirmatory or contradictory movements when I proposed explanatory frameworks for their existence and operational principles. These responses consistently favored models involving dimensional intersection rather than conventional energy projection theories, suggesting entities existing primarily within adjacent reality framework with partial projection capability into our conventional dimensional parameters. As the communication session approached 1 hour duration, the manifestation initiated apparent conclusion sequence, executing comprehensive rotational pattern before beginning dimensional reintegration process. Unlike previous abrupt departures, this transition occurred gradually, allowing detailed documentation of progressive dimensional interface closure. Before complete departure, the entity executed final communicative gesture, generating precisely patterned electromagnetic pulse sequence that registered across multiple instrument types simultaneously. This pattern, when analyzed subsequently, contained mathematical structure suggesting intentional information transfer rather than random energetic discharge. The systematic documentation from this encounter, combined with cumulative data from previous interactions, provided foundation for preliminary theoretical model regarding Rykon's phenomena. The evidence increasingly supported conceptualization not of isolated anomalous events, but rather ongoing interaction between adjacent dimensional frameworks, with certain geographical locations serving as natural intersection points where boundary permeability facilitated cross-dimensional manifestation. The stone circle represented not merely historical cultural site, but rather deliberately constructed interface enhancement mechanism. Its specific geometric properties and geographical positioning amplifying natural boundary permeability conditions. The various manifestation types documented throughout Rykon's history potentially represented different perceptual interpretations of similar cross-dimensional interactions, filtered through observers' cognitive frameworks and cultural expectations. This theoretical model, while necessarily speculative given current scientific paradigm limitations, offered coherent explanatory framework for previously disconnected phenomenological characteristics. The consistent mathematical properties, geographical specificity, and responsive intelligence demonstrated across multiple manifestation types suggested underlying systemic reality rather than isolated anomalous occurrences. Upon returning to university following this culminating research visit, I faced fundamental epistemological challenge: how to integrate direct experiential knowledge of boundary phenomena with conventional academic frameworks that categorically rejected such possibilities. The extensive documentation I had accumulated while compelling to direct observers remained insufficient to overcome entrenched paradigmatic assumptions within established disciplines. Rather than attempting frontal challenge to these limitations, I developed strategic approach focused on methodological innovation rather than immediate conclusion acceptance. My formal academic work expanded instrumentation capabilities for documenting traditionally subjective phenomena, creating measurement systems capable of capturing experiential dimensions previously considered outside objective verification parameters. These methodological innovations found application within conventional research contexts: medical investigations of consciousness alterations during meditative states, environmental monitoring of subtle ecosystem fluctuations, anthropological documentation of cross-cultural perceptual variations. By demonstrating practical utility within accepted frameworks, the approaches developed through Rykon research gained gradual legitimacy without requiring immediate acceptance of their more radical implications. Throughout this process, I maintained connection with Rykon through regular visits and continued documentation. The phenomena persisted with consistent patterns, suggesting stable rather than transient conditions. Local residents, including my extended family, maintained traditional protective practices while increasingly viewing these experiences through combined cultural, scientific, interpretative frameworks, neither dismissing traditional understanding nor rejecting emerging theoretical models. The integration of seemingly contradictory approaches, traditional knowledge systems, acknowledging interdimensional interactions alongside scientific instrumentation, documenting their measurable effects, represented important epistemological advancement. Rather than forcing binary choice between competing explanatory frameworks, this integration recognized complementary contribution potential from diverse knowledge traditions when addressing phenomena at conventional understanding boundaries. As my formal education concluded and professional research opportunities emerged, Rikon remained central reference point for developing expanded investigative methodologies. The experiences there had permanently altered my perception of reality's fundamental structure. Not through abandoning scientific principles, but rather through recognizing their current limitation, boundaries, and development potential. The path forward involves neither uncritical acceptance of traditional explanatory frameworks nor rigid adherence to current scientific paradigm limitations, but rather systematic development of expanded methodologies capable of addressing phenomena currently categorized as unexplainable or subjective. The 5 thresholds of perception, both individual and collective, represent not fixed boundaries but rather developmental frontiers awaiting appropriate investigative approaches. Rikon's phenomena continue their manifestations regardless of observational status or explanatory frameworks. The blue lights still traverse bamboo groves on moonless nights. Shadow entities still occupy dimensional intersection points during boundary condition peaks. Forest sentinels still patrol territorial perimeters when humans venture beyond established pathways after dark. These manifestations represent neither supernatural intrusions into natural order nor mere misperceptions of conventional phenomena, but rather glimpses into reality dimensions that current paradigms cannot fully integrate. The continuing investigation of these boundary phenomena represents not rejection of rational inquiry, but rather its logical extension beyond artificial limitations. The methodologies developed through Rikon research offer potential application across numerous frontier knowledge domains: consciousness studies, quantum observation effects, cultural variation in perception processing, and environmental interaction systems currently considered beyond measurement capability. My journey from frightened observer to systematic researcher parallels broader human knowledge development. Initial fear-based responses to unexplained phenomena gradually yielding to methodical investigation that expands understanding parameters, rather than simply dismissing experiences that challenge existing frameworks. Rikon's haunting manifestations ultimately provided not merely frightening encounters, but rather invaluable opportunities for perception threshold expansion. The path forward involves continued systematic documentation, expanded measurement methodologies, interdisciplinary analytical approaches, and fundamental openness to phenomena currently beyond explanatory frameworks. The thresholds of perception remain neither fixed nor final, but rather represent developmental frontiers awaiting appropriate investigative courage and methodological innovation. As I continue these investigations, Rikon remains both geographical location and conceptual reference point, a place where reality's conventional boundaries demonstrate their permeability and where expanded perception becomes not merely theoretical possibility but direct, experiential necessity. The phenomena there neither confirm nor deny existing belief systems but rather challenge all explanatory frameworks to expand beyond comfortable limitations into more comprehensive understanding of reality's fundamental structure. The shadows of Rikon will continue their manifestations long after current observers and their documentation systems have passed from existence. They represent not transient anomalies, but rather persistent reality aspects awaiting proper integration into expanded understanding frameworks. Their continued presence offers ongoing invitation to transcend perceptual limitations and engage with reality dimensions currently beyond conventional acknowledgement. This ongoing journey toward expanded understanding represents neither conclusion nor closure, but rather commitment to continued exploration of reality's fundamental nature beyond currently acknowledged boundaries. Rikon's phenomena provide not answers but rather essential questions that can potentially transform how humanity conceptualizes its place within multidimensional reality frameworks. The ultimate significance of these experiences lies not in their potential supernatural implications but rather in their challenge to epistemological limitations. The recognition that reality encompasses dimensions beyond current measurement capabilities and conceptual frameworks. This recognition represents not retreat from rational inquiry, but rather its necessary expansion beyond artificial boundaries into more comprehensive understanding of existence itself. I relocated to the small coastal town of Havermill in northern Maine for a research position at the Marine Biology Institute. Despite arriving in early November, I was eager to explore the natural surroundings, particularly Mistwood Sanctuary, a protected forest area that bordered the eastern edge of town. I had heard colleagues mention the scenic hiking paths that wound through the old-growth forest, and with limited social connections in my new home, outdoor exploration seemed like a productive way to spend my weekend. The weather forecast predicted clear skies with moderate temperatures, unusual for that time of year in Maine. I prepared appropriately, packing a small backpack with water, trail mix, a compass, and my phone. The entrance to Mistwood was a mere 10-minute walk from my rented cottage. The forest welcomed me with a crisp, earthy scent and the gentle rustling of leaves. Though most had fallen, patches of dark evergreens provided color against the backdrop of bare deciduous trees. The trail was well marked with blue blazes on trees at regular intervals, and I walked at a comfortable pace, taking occasional photographs of interesting fungi and plant formations. After approximately 45 minutes of hiking, I noticed a thin layer of mist beginning to gather between the trees. This wasn't entirely unexpected near the coast, but something about its movement caught my attention. Rather than drifting with the gentle breeze, it seemed to swirl in contained patterns, almost purposefully. I dismissed this observation as a trick of light and continued walking. The forest had become remarkably quiet. The earlier sounds of birds and small animals had ceased, leaving only the sound of my boots on the leaf-covered path. I checked my watch just past noon. I had plenty of daylight remaining and decided to continue for another hour before turning back. That's when I first heard it. A faint melodic humming coming from somewhere deeper in the forest, off the established trail. The sound was barely perceptible, yet distinctly human, or at least it resembled human vocalization. Male or female, I couldn't determine. It existed at the edge of audibility, haunting and somehow melancholic. I paused, straining to identify the direction. The mist had thickened significantly in the past 10 minutes, reducing visibility to perhaps 50 yards. The humming seemed to come from my left, away from the trail. Common sense dictated staying on the marked path, but curiosity, that most dangerous of human traits, urged me forward. "Hello?" I called out. "Is someone there?" The humming ceased immediately. I waited, listening intently, but heard nothing beyond the occasional drop of moisture from the trees. After nearly a minute of silence, I convinced myself I had imagined it and resumed walking along the trail. 3 steps later, the humming resumed, closer this time, and to my right. I turned sharply, scanning the misty forest. Through the vapor, approximately 30 yards away, I detected movement. A figure, indistinct in the haze, appeared to be standing motionless between 2 ancient oak trees. "Excuse me," I called again. "Are you all right?" The figure made no response but seemed to drift slightly backward, deeper into the mist. I hesitated, torn between concern for a potentially lost hiker and my own safety. Eventually, I stepped off the trail, moving cautiously toward where I had seen the figure. As I approached, I discerned more details. It appeared to be a person of indeterminate gender, dressed in what looked like flowing gray garments that blended with the surrounding mist. Most notable was that the figure seemed partially transparent. I could faintly see the outline of trees behind it. Logic suggested this must be an optical illusion created by the unusual mist patterns, yet my instincts screamed otherwise. I stopped advancing, suddenly aware of the profound silence surrounding me. No birds, no insects, not even the sound of wind in the branches. "Do you need help?" I asked, my voice sounding unnaturally loud in the stillness. The figure turned, or seemed to turn, and I caught a glimpse of what might have been a face. It was difficult to process what I saw. Features that appeared fluid, constantly shifting and reforming, with only the suggestion of eyes, dark hollows where mist swirled more densely. Then it was moving away from me, its form becoming more indistinct with each yard of distance. Against my better judgment, I followed. The rational part of my mind offered explanations: unusual atmospheric conditions, fatigue, perhaps even mild hypoxia from the altitude. Yet I pursued this apparition deeper into the forest, leaving the trail far behind. Time became difficult to track. The mist thickened until visibility reduced to mere feet in any direction. My phone's GPS showed no signal, and the compass spinning erratically suggested some form of magnetic anomaly in the area. The humming continued intermittently, always just ahead, drawing me forward. I'm uncertain how long I wandered. The consistent gray light filtering through the mist made it impossible to judge the sun's position. Eventually I stopped, finally acknowledging that I was hopelessly lost. The temperature had dropped noticeably, and the mist now carried a bitter chill that penetrated my jacket. I attempted to retrace my steps, but found no recognizable landmarks. Each direction appeared identical, gray trees emerging from and disappearing into swirling vapor. I pulled out my phone to check the time, 4:38 p.m. Daylight would last only another hour at most. I needed to establish some direction, find the trail again, or at minimum, locate a suitable place to wait until morning. That's when I noticed the silence had changed. The utter absence of sound had been replaced by something more unsettling, a soft susurration, like countless whispers just below the threshold of comprehension. It seemed to emanate from the mist itself, surrounding me completely. I forced myself to remain calm, to think logically. I pulled out my compass again, finding it still useless. I would have to rely on natural navigation methods, moss growth, tree branching patterns, but in the dim light and thick mist, these were difficult to discern. The whispering intensified, and with growing horror, I realized I could almost understand fragments of words, not in English, not in any language I recognized, yet somehow conveying meaning, invitation, hunger, loneliness. The mist began to change. What had been formless vapor now appeared to coalesce into numerous vaguely humanoid shapes, surrounding me in a loose circle. None were as distinct as the figure I had initially followed, but all possessed those same disturbing characteristics, shifting features and dark, swirling voids where eyes should be. I retreated until my back pressed against a large tree trunk. The figures drew closer, the whispering growing more urgent. With trembling hands, I fumbled for my phone's flashlight, hoping light might disperse whatever atmospheric phenomenon was causing these hallucinations. The beam cut through the mist, temporarily creating a tunnel of visibility. The figures seemed to recoil, their forms becoming less distinct. Taking advantage of their retreat, I pushed forward in the direction the light pointed, moving as quickly as I dared through the treacherous terrain. The whispering followed, sometimes fading, sometimes intensifying, but never completely disappearing. Occasionally I caught glimpses of the figures reforming at the edge of my light's reach. Twice I nearly lost my footing on slippery moss-covered stones, and once I stumbled into a shallow depression filled with icy water that soaked through my hiking boots. The temperature continued to drop. My extremities grew numb, and my breath formed thick clouds in the beam of my flashlight. The phone's battery indicator warned of imminent shutdown, perhaps 15 minutes of light remaining at most. That's when I noticed something ahead, a different quality of darkness. Not the gray opacity of mist, but the solid blackness of a substantial object. Moving cautiously forward, I discovered a stone structure, partially collapsed but still offering shelter. It appeared to be the remnants of an old boundary wall or perhaps a small outbuilding. With no better options, I clambered over the fallen stones to reach the relatively protected interior space. The walls blocked some of the mist, creating a small pocket of improved visibility. I directed my failing flashlight around the enclosure, finding it empty, save for years of accumulated leaf litter and a few small animal bones. I wedged myself into a corner where two walls met, providing maximum protection from the elements and a defensive position against whatever might approach. My phone battery failed moments later, plunging me into near-total darkness. The whispering crescendoed immediately, as if the mist figures had been waiting for this moment. Through gaps in the stonework, I could see the vapor thickening, forming more substantial apparitions. The temperature plummeted further. My breath now emerged in painful gasps of frigid air. One figure, more defined than the others, pushed through a large opening in the wall. It resembled the entity I had first followed, but appeared more substantial now. As it approached, I could see that what I had mistaken for gray clothing was actually its form, mist condensed to the consistency of thin fabric, constantly shifting and reforming. Where a face should have been, the mist swirled more densely, occasionally forming the suggestion of human features before dissolving again. Only the eyes remained constant, not eyes in the conventional sense, but rather absences. voids in the mist that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. The whispering focused, becoming a single voice, still incomprehensible, yet conveying emotions rather than words, loneliness, hunger, and something that felt disturbingly like joy. The figure extended what might have been an arm, reaching toward me. The temperature around me dropped so severely that the moisture in the air began crystallizing, forming delicate patterns of frost on the stones beside me. My lungs burned with each inhalation of the supernaturally cold air. I pressed further into my corner, searching frantically for anything that might serve as a weapon or deterrent. My hand closed around a broken piece of stone, jagged and heavy. In desperation, I hurled it directly at the approaching figure. The stone passed through the misty form without resistance, clattering against the wall beyond. The entity paused momentarily, the swirling patterns of its composition disturbed, then continued its advance. Its arm-like extension was inches from my face when I noticed something. The small digital watch on my wrist, with its modest backlight, seemed to cause distortion in the entity's form wherever the light touched it. The mist being withdrew slightly, the whispering taking on a quality I could only interpret as discomfort. Light. They retreated from my flashlight earlier. With numbed fingers, I fumbled with the watch, managing to activate its alarm function. The small screen glowed brighter, and the entity withdrew further. Its form becoming less substantial, I held the watch out like a talisman, waving it toward the mist figures that had gathered at the opening in the wall. They maintained their distance, their whispering now carrying tones of frustration and anger. The standoff continued for what felt like hours. I remained huddled in my corner, watch extended, fighting against exhaustion and the dangerous drowsiness induced by the cold. The mist beings hovered at the edge of the watch's feeble light, occasionally testing its boundaries but retreating when the illumination touched them. At some point during this vigil, I must have lost consciousness despite my determination to remain awake. When awareness returned, pale natural light was filtering through the mist. The stone enclosure was empty of anything but ordinary morning fog, and the temperature, while cold, had returned to seasonal norms. I stood on unsteady legs, muscles protesting after hours of immobility in the cold. Outside the stone structure, the forest appeared entirely normal. No sign of the unnatural mist or its inhabitants. In the distance, perhaps a quarter-mile away, I could see a flash of blue, a trail marker. The hike back to town was uneventful. I reached the main trail within 30 minutes and followed it directly to the forest entrance. Upon returning to my cottage, I discovered my ordeal had lasted nearly 20 hours. I had entered Mistwood shortly after 10 a.m. the previous day and emerged just after 6 a.m. I reported nothing to local authorities. What could I say that wouldn't sound like the product of hypothermia-induced hallucination? Instead, I conducted research at the town's small historical society, discovering references to mistwalkers in local folklore dating back to early colonial times. The accounts described travelers lost in the forest who encountered beings of fog and vapor that whispered in unknown tongues. Those who survived reported the entities seemed to feed on warmth and vitality. Most telling was a journal entry from 1887, written by a local physician. It appears these manifestations retreat from artificial light, particularly that produced by flame. The more intense the illumination, the more complete their dissolution. I hypothesize that the concentrated energy disrupts whatever electromagnetic anomaly permits their existence. I left Havermill 2 weeks later, citing family emergency to terminate my contract at the Institute. Before departing, I posted warning signs at the Mistwood Trail entrance, cautioning hikers about sudden fog conditions and recommending they carry multiple light sources. The town council removed them within days, concerned about tourism impact. 3 hikers have disappeared in Mistwood since my departure. Searches found no trace, and officials blamed treacherous terrain and exposure to elements. I know better, but who would believe my account? I reside in Arizona now, in a desert community where fog is virtually non-existent. Yet on certain nights, when the air grows unexpectedly chill, I wake to find condensation on my bedroom windows, forming patterns that bear unsettling resemblance to faces. And just at the threshold of hearing, something whispers in a language I almost understand. For those who venture into forests where mist gathers unnaturally, carry light, multiple sources if possible. And if you hear humming or whispers from the vapor, return to open ground immediately. What waits in the mist has existed for centuries, perhaps millennia, and its hunger is patient and enduring.